The booth was empty. It had been empty for a week, and its emptiness was a presence, a void that pulled at the edges of the familiar diner hum. For 15 years, Elena had seen him there. Same booth, same time, every Tuesday and Friday, without fail. He was a constant, a landmark in the shifting landscape of her life. She never knew his name. To her, he was just Seth, a quiet man with eyes that saw too much and a stillness that silenced the air around him. He sat with his back to the wall, always facing the door. He drank his coffee black and ate his steak rare. He read the newspaper, folded just so, and he never, ever smiled. But he tipped. He tipped in crisp $50 bills, sometimes $100, left discreetly under the saucer. For a cup of coffee and a steak. It was more than generosity, it was a statement. A quiet acknowledgement that he saw her, saw the weariness in her shoulders and the worn-out soles of her shoes. Now, the vinyl of the booth was cold. The Formica tabletop, usually warmed by his presence and his coffee cup, was sterile and unwelcoming. Elena polished it for the 10th time that morning, her rag moving in slow, sad circles. The diner felt wrong without him. Unbalanced. The bell over the door chimed, a familiar, cheerful sound that felt intrusive today. A man stepped in, and he was not a regular. He was dressed in a suit so dark and perfectly tailored it seemed to absorb the light. He was younger than the man from the booth, but he had the same stillness, the same air of quiet danger. Elena had seen him before, standing by the man's car, a silent shadow waiting to drive his boss away. He scanned the room, his eyes skipping over the few breakfast patrons before they landed on her. He walked directly to the counter, his steps measured and silent. "You're Elena?" he asked. His voice was low, respectful. She nodded, her hand tightening around the damp rag. "Yes." The man placed a heavy, cream-colored envelope on the counter. It was sealed with a black wax stamp, an elaborate SB pressed into its center. "My employer has passed away," he said, his tone flat, betraying no emotion. "He left this for you." The words didn't register at first. Passed away. The quiet man. Gone. The foundation of her Tuesdays and Fridays had crumbled without a sound. A strange, hollow feeling bloomed in her chest, an unexpected grief for a man she didn't know. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice a whisper. The man gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "He wanted you to have this." His instructions were very specific. He pushed the envelope a little closer. "He said you earned it." "Earned it?" She had poured coffee. She had served steak. What could she have possibly earned from a man like that? A man who commanded such silent, unwavering respect from men in $1,000 suits. She reached for the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a thick card. An invitation. It was for a funeral service for one Silas Blackwood. And tucked behind it, cold and solid, was a small, old-fashioned brass key. Silas Blackwood. So, he had a name. She looked from the key to the man's impassive face, 100 questions swirling in her mind. Why her? A simple waitress. What was this key for? Why did this intimidating stranger, this Silas Blackwood, think of her at the end? Her predictable, quiet world had just been fractured, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had to go to that funeral. She had to understand. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will change how you see the smallest acts of kindness forever. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what we have coming up. And let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing how far our stories travel. Now, let's get started. The drive to the cemetery was long, taking her to a part of the city she had only ever seen on the news. Manicured lawns and towering marble monuments stretched out under a solemn grey sky. Elena felt impossibly small, her worn-out sedan looking like a stray animal among the gleaming black town cars that lined the narrow road. As she walked toward the gathering, she clutched the heavy invitation in her hand, the engraved letters of his name feeling foreign and unreal. Silas Blackwood. She said it over and over in her mind, trying to fit the name to the face of the quiet man in the booth. It didn't fit. Surf was a presence. Silas Blackwood was a name, a label for a life she knew nothing about. Her memories of him were a collection of silent moments, a mosaic built over 15 years. She remembered the first time he came in. She was new, nervous, her hand shaking as she poured his coffee. He hadn't said a word, just watched her with those unnerving, steady eyes. When he left, a $50 bill was sitting on the table. It was more than she made in a whole shift. She had thought it was a mistake. But it wasn't. It became his ritual. He never commented on the food. He never engaged in small talk. He simply existed in that booth, a fixed point in her chaotic world. Through the years, she had watched him. She saw men in expensive suits approach his table, heads bowed, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. They would hand him envelopes, and he would dismiss them with a curt nod. She saw politicians, their faces familiar from the evening news, sit across from him, their public confidence replaced by a nervous deference. He never acknowledged her observations. His world and hers were separate, touching only at the rim of a coffee cup. Yet, in small ways, he had shown he was aware. She remembered a winter when her son, Daniel, was sick with pneumonia. She had been working double shifts to cover the medical bills, the exhaustion etched onto her face. One Friday, after he left, she found $200 bills under his saucer. Not a word was said. None was needed. She remembered telling him, in a rare moment of chatter, that Daniel had made the honor roll. She had been so proud, the words just tumbled out. He had looked up from his newspaper, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual, and given a single, slow nod. The next week, the tip was $500. These memories swirled as she approached the large, somber crowd gathered around a magnificent marble mausoleum. These were the people from his world. The men in dark suits, the women in elegant black dresses and veils. They stood in tight, quiet clusters, their faces hard and unreadable. They were the powerful, the feared, the untouchable. And here she was. Elena, the waitress, in her best Sunday coat that was still 10 years out of style. She felt a deep, gnawing anxiety. This was a mistake. She didn't belong here. She was a ghost from a different life, a life he had visited twice a week. As she began to turn away, a hand gently touched her elbow. It was the man from the diner, the one who had given her the invitation. His name, she learned later, was Leo. "Elena," he said, his voice a low murmur. "We saved a place for you." He guided her through the crowd, which parted for them silently. The whispers died as she passed. Eyes followed her, curious and questioning. Who was this woman? Why was Leo, Silas Blackwood's most trusted lieutenant, escorting her to the front? He led her to a single empty chair in the front row, next to an elderly woman who radiated a quiet, steely authority. Elena sat, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was on display, a puzzle these people were trying to solve. But as the eulogies began, a different story started to unfold. Men with scarred knuckles and hardened faces spoke of Silas Blackwood's loyalty. They spoke of a man who kept his word, no matter the cost. They spoke of a strict, unbending code of honor. They painted a picture of a king, a patriarch who ruled his kingdom with an iron fist but a fair hand. It was all so grand, so violent, so far removed from the quiet man who read the paper in her diner. And then, her own memories began to surface, pushing through the fog of the present. One memory in particular, an event from 5 years ago that she had tried to bury. The real reason she was here. The reason a man like Silas Blackwood would remember a waitress on his deathbed. It had started with her son. Daniel was 17 then, a good boy with a fierce desire to help his mother. He saw how she struggled, how she came home with aching feet and a tired spirit. He wanted to ease her burden. So, he had done something foolish. He had borrowed money. Not from a bank. From a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a predator who circled the desperate neighborhoods of the city, offering quick cash at impossible interest rates. Daniel had borrowed $500 to fix their car so Elena wouldn't have to take the bus. Within months, that $500 had become $5,000. Thorne's men started calling, their voices slick with menace. Then they started showing up. Elena had been terrified. She had no one to turn to. The police couldn't help, it was a civil matter, they said, a bad loan. But she knew it was more than that. She saw the look in the eyes of the men who came to her door. It was an ownership. They owned her son. One night, they took him. They said he had to work off the debt. They put him in a car and drove away, leaving Elena standing on the sidewalk, her world collapsing into a black hole of fear. She had never felt so helpless, so utterly alone. She didn't sleep. She spent the night pacing her small apartment, her mind a whirlwind of horrific possibilities. The next day was a Tuesday. She went to work in a daze, her movements robotic. Her soul had been hollowed out. And then he came in. The quiet man. He sat in his booth, unfolded his newspaper, and waited for his coffee. Elena approached, the pot shaking in her hand. He looked up, and for the first time in all the years she had served him, his expression changed. The impassive mask cracked, and she saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Concern. He saw her. He truly saw her despair. He watched as she fumbled with the cup, coffee sloshing over the side. He didn't say anything. He just watched, his gaze intense, analytical. He looked at the dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands, the raw terror she couldn't hide. She put the cup down and fled to the kitchen, leaning against the cold steel of the refrigerator, trying to breathe. What was she going to do? What could she possibly do? And then, a crazy, desperate idea began to form. This man. He was powerful. She didn't know how, but she knew it as surely as she knew her own name. The way other men deferred to him, the fear and respect in their eyes. He was somebody. Somebody who could make things happen. What was the worst that could happen? He could say no. He could ignore her. He could have her thrown out. But her son was gone. There was nothing left to lose. She walked back out of the kitchen, her fear momentarily eclipsed by her mother's desperate courage. She walked straight to his booth. He looked up from his paper, one eyebrow slightly raised. His bodyguards, two large men sitting at the counter, tensed. She ignored them. She looked directly at the man. Sir. I need your help, she said, her voice shaking but clear. One of the bodyguards started to rise, a low growl in his throat. The man in the booth lifted one hand, a small, almost lazy gesture, and the bodyguard froze, sitting back down immediately. The diner seemed to fall silent around them. He folded his newspaper, placing it carefully on the table. He gave her his full, undivided attention. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. I don't know who you are, she began, the words spilling out in a frantic rush. But I see you. I see how people treat you. You're important. You're powerful. And I have nowhere else to go. She told him everything. About Daniel. About the loan. About Marcus Thorne. About the men who had taken her son. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She needed him to see the full scope of her pain. When she finished, a heavy silence hung in the air. He just looked at her, his face unreadable again. She felt a crushing wave of despair. She had been a fool. A man like him didn't get involved in the messy, pathetic lives of waitresses. She started to turn away, a choked apology on her lips. I'm sorry to bother you, sir. Wait, he said. His voice was quiet, but it had the force of a command. She stopped, her back to him. What is the name of the man who holds your son's debt? She turned back, hope, fragile and terrifying, blooming in her chest. Thorne. Marcus Thorne. He nodded slowly. He pulled a phone from his jacket pocket, a simple, old-fashioned flip phone. He dialed a single number. "Leo," he said into the phone, his eyes never leaving Elena's. "Marcus Thorne. Find out everything. Location, operation, manpower. Everything. He has a boy. A 17-year-old named Daniel. Find the boy. Keep him safe. I'm on my way." He closed the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at Elena, his gaze softening for just a fraction of a second. It was a look that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was a look of understanding. A look that said he knew this kind of fear, this kind of desperation, intimately. "Go home, Elena," he said, using her name for the very first time. "Lock your doors. Don't open them for anyone. I will bring your son back to you." It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact. He stood, dropping a $100 bill on the table for a coffee he hadn't touched. He walked out of the diner, his Lieutenant Leo falling into step behind him. The balance of the world had shifted on its axis. Elena didn't remember the rest of her shift. She didn't remember driving home. She just remembered locking her door, the sound of the deadbolt clicking into place feeling like the first safe breath she had taken in months. She sat on her couch and waited. She put her faith in a man whose name she still didn't know. The flashback was so vivid, so real, that for a moment Elena forgot where she was. The sound of a final prayer brought her back to the present, to the cold air of the cemetery and the somber faces around her. The funeral was ending. She had not seen Silas again for 2 days after that terrible Tuesday. She stayed in her apartment, a prisoner of hope and fear. And then, late on Thursday night, there was a knock on her door. Not the aggressive banging of Thorne's thugs, but a soft, gentle knock. She looked through the peephole and saw Daniel standing there, his face pale and bruised, but his eyes clear. And behind him, standing in the shadows of the hallway, was the quiet man. She threw the door open and pulled her son into an embrace so tight it hurt. She sobbed into his shoulder, relief washing over her in a tidal wave. After a long moment, she looked up at the man. He hadn't moved. He was just watching them, his expression distant, almost sad. "He's safe," he said. It was all he needed to say. Daniel, free from the immediate terror, was full of the story. He told her in hurried, breathless sentences. How the man, Silas, had walked into the warehouse where Thorne kept him. He said it was like a scene from a movie. Thorne's men, big and loud and brutal, had simply been neutralized. They moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency, his men. There was no chaotic fight, just a series of swift, precise movements, and then it was over. Daniel said the man had walked right up to Marcus Thorne, who had been blustering and threatening until he saw the look in the man's eyes. And then he had gone very, very quiet. He didn't even shout, Daniel had told her, his own eyes wide with awe. He just talked to him. He told Thorne about you, Mom. He said your name. He talked about you working at the diner for 15 years, about your hands being rough from the dishwater. He said that a man who threatens a woman like you has no honor. He said he was a sickness. And that he was the cure. Daniel didn't know what happened after that. The man's lieutenant, Leo, had escorted him out to a car and driven him home. Marcus Thorne and his crew were never seen or heard from again. The police found the warehouse empty, as if it had been scrubbed clean. The debt, the threats, the fear, it had all vanished into the night. Standing in her doorway, Elena had tried to find the words to thank him. How do you thank someone for giving you back your world? For giving you back your son? She had rushed to her room and grabbed her emergency savings, a small bundle of cash totaling just over $700. It was everything she had. She ran back and tried to press it into his hand. Please, she had begged. It's not enough, I know, but it's all I have. He looked down at the crumpled bills in her hand, and then back at her face. He gently pushed her hand away. No, he said, his voice soft. You don't owe me anything. "But I have to give you something," she insisted. He was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting to the small, framed photo of Daniel on her wall. 15 years of good coffee, poured by a good woman, he said finally. "Consider us even." Before he turned to leave, Daniel, filled with a teenager's blunt courage, stepped forward. "Who are you?" he asked. Are you a bad guy?" The man had looked at Daniel, and the corner of his mouth twitched, the closest she had ever seen him come to a smile. "I am what I need to be," he had said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple, stark white business card. There was no name, no company. Just a phone number. He handed it to Elena. "If anyone ever troubles you or your son again," he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone, "you call this number. They will not trouble you a second time." And then he was gone, disappearing down the hallway as silently as he had arrived. She never had to use the number. The card sat in her jewelry box, a talisman of protection. His quiet presence in the diner on Tuesdays and Fridays was all the reassurance she needed. He never mentioned that night. They went back to their old routine. He was Sir, she was the waitress. But something had changed. An invisible thread now connected them. A debt of gratitude on her side, and on his, she didn't know. A sense of responsibility? A moment of connection to a world he had long since left behind. Now he was gone. And she was sitting at his funeral, the secret of his greatest kindness locked in her heart. The crowd began to disperse. People filed past the mausoleum, touching the cold marble, whispering their last goodbyes. Elena remained seated, unsure of what to do next. The key in her pocket felt heavy, a final, unanswered question. Leo appeared at her side again. "Come with me," he said gently. "There's one last thing." He led her away from the gravesite, back to the line of black cars. He opened the door to the largest one, a gleaming Rolls-Royce that looked like it belonged to royalty. Inside, a man in a pinstripe suit sat with a leather briefcase on his lap. He introduced himself as Silas Blackwood's personal lawyer. Mr. Blackwood was a man of particular habits, the lawyer began, his tone dry and professional. He was also meticulous in his planning. He left a number of final arrangements. "You, Miss Garcia, were one of them." He gestured to the key in her hand. "That key opens a safe deposit box at the downtown branch of the First National Bank. The contents are legally and irrevocably yours." Elena stared at the key. "But why? What's in it?" Leo answered before the lawyer could. "The boss believed in paying his debts. He felt he owed you 1 inch." "He didn't owe me anything," Elena whispered. "I owed him everything." To him, honor was a two-way street, Leo said. He said you reminded him of his mother. She was a waitress, too. Worked herself to an early grave trying to provide for him. He never forgot that. He spent his life trying to protect women like her. Like you. The revelation struck Elena with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a random act of kindness. It was personal. In her, he had seen his own history, his own pain. In saving her son, he had been saving a piece of himself. The next day, she went to the bank. Her hands shook as she gave the key to the clerk. She was led into a vault, a cold, silent room of polished steel. The clerk unlocked a small box and slid it out, leaving her alone with it in a private viewing room. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, there were several documents. The first was the deed to her apartment. It was marked in bold red letters, paid in full. She stared at it, her mind struggling to comprehend. He had paid off her mortgage. Anonymously. Years ago. All those years she had been scrimping and saving, he had already lifted the biggest burden from her shoulders without her ever knowing. Beneath the deed was a savings bond. A college fund, established 5 years ago, in Daniel's name. It had matured into a sum so large it made her dizzy. It was enough for any university he wanted to attend, for medical school, for a future she had only ever dreamed of giving him. And at the very bottom of the box, there was a single, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a note, written in a strong, clear hand. It was only 4 sentences long. "Thank you for the coffee, Elena. You reminded me of what was important. Be safe. Be happy." Tears she didn't know she had left began to fall, splashing onto the crisp paper. She held the note to her chest, the simple words a final, intimate goodbye from the man she had never truly known. He had been her guardian angel, a dark, silent protector watching over her from his corner booth. He had built an empire of fear and power, but he had used that power to build a wall around her and her son, a wall of safety and opportunity. She sat in that cold, quiet room for a long time, holding the remnants of a secret friendship. A friendship built on nothing more than black coffee, rare steak, and a shared, unspoken understanding of how hard the world could be. Years passed. Daniel went to college, and then to medical school. He became a doctor, a healer, working in the very same neighborhoods that men like Marcus Thorne once preyed upon. He dedicated his life to helping people, a testament to the second chance he had been given by a mysterious benefactor. Elena finally retired from the diner. She lived comfortably, her days quiet and peaceful. She never had to worry about money again. But every Tuesday and Friday, she would feel a small pang of absence, a memory of a quiet presence in a corner booth. In her new home, on a small table in the living room, she kept 2 things. The simple white business card with only a phone number on it, and the handwritten note from the safe deposit box, now framed in silver. They were mementos of the strange, silent man who had changed her life. The man whose name she only learned at his funeral. Sometimes, when she looked at them, she would think about the nature of good and evil. The world had called Silas Blackwood a criminal, a gangster, a bad man. And perhaps he was. But for her, for a desperate waitress with nowhere else to turn, he had been a savior. He had been the only good in a world of bad. True character, she realized, is not defined by a person's reputation or the life they lead in the public eye. It is measured in the quiet moments, in the choices made when no one is watching. It is found in the kindness offered to those who can give nothing in return. Silas Blackwood had lived a life in the shadows, but his legacy, for her, was one of pure, unwavering light.